Okay. Well, I will go ahead and get us started. So, welcome to our 2020 Elon Feminist Roundtable on the subject of lived experiences of sexual and gender-based violence and strategies of resistance. My name is Lauren Guilmette. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an assistant professor of philosophy at Elon University. I'm proud to be moderating this event alongside two of my undergraduate philosophy majors, Alexa Rasmussen and Liza Margules. And I'm appreciative of the hard work that they put in over the last couple of weeks to think through these texts with me, to pose questions I could not have generated myself, and to think through how best to set up this event. So thank you, Liza and Alexa. First, I will briefly introduce my colleague and mentor, Dr. Ann Cahill, followed by brief introductions of Dr. Heyes and Dr. Taylor by Liza and Alexa, respectively. So, Ann Cahill is Professor of Philosophy and Director of National and International Fellowships at Elon University. She received her PhD in philosophy from SUNY Stony Brook and joined the faculty of Elon in 1998. Her 2001 book, Rethinking Rape, counters legal and feminist definitions of rape as mere assault and decisively emphasizes the centrality of the body and sexuality in a crime which plays a crucial role in the continuing oppression of women and feminine agency. Her 2010 monograph challenges the notion of objectification for its implicit vilification of the body and sexuality, and instead posits that the harms associated with objectification follow not from rendering women as objects solely, but from constructing feminine subjectivity and sexuality as derivative of masculine forms. Her forthcoming book, co-authored with Christine Hamill of Boston University, develops a theory of intervocality, an understanding of the ways in which voices develop in the context of complex political and social relationships, as well as vocal justice.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you everyone so much for coming. So Cressida Heyes is currently a professor of political science and philosophy at the University of Alberta and the Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Gender and Sexuality. Dr. Heyes was born and raised in England and received her BA with honors from Oxford and her MA and her PhD from McGill. She is the co-editor of 2 volumes, including a co-edited feminist primer on cosmetic surgery and author of 4 monographs, most recently Aesthetics of Existence. This 2020 text, which has been my focus this semester, engages the demand of post-disciplinary time in our neoliberal society and considers how moments of anesthesia and losing, or as Dianna Taylor might say it, loosening, consciousness as a form of feminist resistance. Heyes is interested in the things that happen to us that nonetheless are excluded from our sense of experience. And in the chapter of focus for this specific conversation, she engages the particular trauma of sexual violence while unconscious and counters the victim blaming that all too often accompanies this kind of violence by critically engaging neoliberal conceptions of agency.
Thank you very much.
And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Dianna Taylor. So Dr. Dianna Taylor is the Don Shula Chair of Philosophy at Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio. She received her master's and PhD in philosophy from SUNY Binghamton, as well as a master's in women's studies from the University of Cincinnati. Her edited and co-edited volumes include Michael Foucault, Key Concepts in Feminism as the Final Foucault. This year, she published a monograph, Sexual Violence and Humiliation, a Foucaultian Feminist Perspective. In this text, which has been my focus this semester, Taylor writes about humiliation as a key harm of sexual violence against women, showing that humiliation manifests within the relation of self to itself. Dr. Taylor discusses Foucault's critique of subjectivity and how it provides important resources for feminist conceptualization and countering of sexual violence and humiliation. Dr. Taylor draws on concrete, recent, and contemporary instances of sexual violence against women and feminist anti-sexual violence protests to illustrate the cultivation of alternative modes of self-relation, furthers rather than undermines feminist efforts to combat sexual violence.
Thank you,
Alexa.
Thank you. And so I want to let folks in the audience know that there is a Q&A section, right? You're welcome to type in a question at any point, and I will do my best to make sure we get to it in the Q&A. And I also want to say, so we're going to briefly open to some introductory comments, and then we will have a roundtable discussion. I also want to let the 3 panelists know that they are welcome to also ask questions of one another. You know, these are our questions that we're so excited to hear what you you think, but we also open space for you to ask questions of one another. And again, we are just so grateful for your time with us today. We now welcome introductory comments from our three invited speakers. First, Dr. Cahill, then Dr. Hayes, and then Dr. Taylor. We're grateful to these three speakers for their time today, as well as for their insights.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. And I want to start by returning those thanks. Lauren has put together this amazing senior seminar, which intersects with these amazing gatherings of scholars from all over the country, and enhancing both of those communities and their philosophical engagement. So I want to thank Dr. Guilmette and all of her students who've put so much time and effort into this event. It's really a wonderful thing to pull off. And then the second thing I want to say as a preface to my remarks is that I always think it's really important when we start talking philosophically about sexual assault, that we remember that we are not talking about some far off puzzle, that we are not talking about some theoretical set of contradictions. We're talking about a set of lived experiences that all too many people who are attending this webinar have themselves experienced firsthand. And it's my hope that our work can lend some insight and can meet those experiences with respect. So this is not something that we're talking about as an object outside of it, but it is something that is very much enmeshed in all of our lives. So I told Dr. Guilmette before we started that I was going to violate the promise of the blurb and not actually talk about my most recent research, which is, as Dr. Guilmette mentioned, is on voice as human-generated sound. But actually, I'm going to go back to my first book, Rethinking Rape, and just pull out probably the most central theme to it, a theme that's picked up in the work of both of our other panelists today, who I'm just so delighted to see. And I just feel like I better be honest and say it's such, I'm almost giddy with the possibility of talking philosophy with Cressida and Dianna. Like, I can barely stand it. So thank you for putting all of us together. These are some of my favorite people to think with. Okay, so in Rethinking Rape, which was my first book, I attempted to move past what I saw as an impasse in feminist theory about how we conceptualized sexual assault. Briefly, I saw two schools of thought. One that I associated with Susan Brown Miller that argued that sexual assault is primarily about power, not sex. You might hear this frequently referred to in mainstream discourse as a sort of obvious point. And in her book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape in 1975, she argued that any attention paid to sexuality in the context of sexual assault was misplaced, and that we needed to understand it as a straightforward act of domination and power. And then Catherine McKinnon came along in the 1980s and argued along very different lines of thought, arguing that, in fact, it was a serious mistake to distinguish rape and sexual assault too strictly from everyday hegemonic heterosexual interactions, that in fact, the way those were connected, what underlied them, what sort of underpinned both and caused them both to be part and parcel of a misogynist worldview and political structure was more important. So sometimes McKinnon's view is simplified to say that all heterosexual sex is rape. If my good friend Susan Bryson, who wrote another crucial book on this matter, Aftermath, if she were here, she would not let any of us get away with that. And in fact, you cannot find a sentence where McKinnon does that. But nevertheless, I would argue that McKinnon's theoretical motivation is to draw connections to and to problematize separating sexual assault from hegemonic heterosexual interactions. So I thought there were problems with both of these approaches. And I set out in Rethinking Rape to bring to bear some new contemporary philosophical tools, primarily coming from contemporary feminist theories of the body, that I thought could help us to understand the social and political phenomenon of sexual assault better. And in doing so, I was trying to really conceptualize rape as an embodied experience, and to bring with the body, to bring bodily differences and their relevance to the phenomenon. I was particularly keen to explore how a notion of intercorporeality, or I usually frame it as embodied intersubjectivity, could help to explain both the phenomenon of sexual assault and its particular harms. And briefly, the idea here is that both embodiment, both the the fact that we are stuff, the fact that we are material, and relation to others, the fact that we are constantly in relation to others, is central to subjectivity, is central to human being, existential human being, to the human ability to engage with the world as a sensing, acting, active entity. And then in fact, embodiment and relation are themselves related. It matters that subjectivity involves materiality, and the particular forms of embodiment that we take up, that we live through, are always under constant construction in context of relations to others. So for example, if any of you who identify as US inhabitants of the US have been abroad and sometimes have found yourself being identified by your mere gait sometimes, right? Or by the gestures that one makes with one's various limbs, right? This is ways in which our very bodily modalities are always in process and always influenced by the others and by social and political dynamics. Okay, so another way to say this is that in relating to each other, we're constantly shaping each other's material being and subjective possibilities, and that's an ongoing process. So what does this have to do with sexual assault? So I argue that sexual assault is an attempt to both reject and exploit this embodied subjective co-constitution by imposing a sexual physical interaction where only one person's subjectivity is in play, or at least that's how it seems. So I say this is an attempt to reject and exploit. So on the one hand, it's an attempt to reject. It's an attempt on the part of the assailant to reduce the possibility of interaction to simply action upon, right? To say that what this interaction is going to be dictated by my aims, by my choices, by my desires. You, the victim, are not going to have an impact on what is happening. You will be overwhelmed subjectively. So in that sense, the assailant is attempting to transcend intersubjectivity, right? That's a tyrannical move, an ontologically tyrannical move, I would argue. And on the other hand, it's an exploitation of that very vulnerability, right? Our embodied intersubjectivity leads us necessarily and ineluctably vulnerable to the other. When I'm speaking, this is a little interesting, it's a little different, but when I'm speaking in real life, not in real life, when I'm speaking in person, when we're co-breathing, I often say, listen, I'm only giving this talk because y'all have decided not to rise up and beat the hell out of me, right? You could, like it would work, right? But my being able to give this talk is contingent, right? And if anything, I mean, this pandemic has revealed so many of our social weaknesses and inequalities, and it's also shown us just in another way how dependent we are on each other in all sorts of ways, and how porous we are. That's what I'm getting at, how porous we are in a fundamental level. And that porousness, that vulnerability, is exploited in sexual assault. Okay. I use the metaphor of the eclipse to talk about how an assailant thwarts the victim's capacity to shape the interaction, rendering the victim agentially nullified. It matters in my analysis that this thwarting is sexual in nature, and precisely because it's embodied, its harms are also embodied. But embodied subjects are always in process, and eclipses aren't permanent. That's not to argue for a clear-cut sense of healing. I reject that sense, as Susan Bryson does in her book Aftermath. But the embodied subject is always in process. Therefore, other relations ensue. Those relations could forward flourishing, or they can continue to impose harm and violence upon that body. So I argue that while a sexual assault leaves an indelible mark on one's embodied being, it's not the last mark that will be made, and the subject continues to have relations with others. I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Cressida.
Okay, let me know if there's any problem hearing me. It's really exciting to be here, and thank you so much to Dr. Guilmette and to everybody who has helped with the organization of this event. It's a pleasure to be joining you from Treaty 6 territory. I live in Edmonton, Alberta, where, as I look outside the window, we're just having our first snow of the year, which is very late for us. This is the latest in the 20 years I've lived here that we've had our first snow. This is an incredible historical gathering place for diverse Indigenous people peoples. And so it is my pleasure to be a member of a treaty people here. I also wanted to acknowledge Dr. Cahill's point that this is likely to be an event that many survivors of sexual violence are attending, and to say that the work I'm going to be alluding to that I've done in the past, but also looking forward a little bit at some of my future projects, is all about sexual violence against people who are unconscious or semi-conscious. And so that if that theme is something that you need a content warning about, then here it is. I do have some images, but none of them are sexually explicit. So just some years ago, I started working for various reasons that I don't have time to get into on an article that ended up being published in the journal Science called Dead to the World, Rape, Sexual, what's it called? Oh God, Rape, Unconsciousness and Social Media. Thank you, Brian. And I also kept working on that. And as academics often do, I republished it in an updated and slightly expanded version as chapter 2 of the book that Liza referred to at the beginning, Anesthetics of Existence, which has just recently come out with Duke University Press. And that work is actually indebted to Dr. Cahill's, as well as to other scholars who've come before, in that what I wanted to think through was a particular problem, which is that many sexual assaults, and really a surprisingly high number of sexual assaults are committed against people who are unconscious, whether they are asleep, whether they're drunk, whether they're drugged, whether they are anesthetized, whether they're in a coma, whether they've had a head injury. So there are actually many different reasons that people can be not conscious, and it's a little bit sloppy to call them all unconsciousness, but that's what I'm going to do just as shorthand. And that these assaults were incredibly commonplace and incredibly diverse. And what that article was trying to think through is, what is the distinctive wrong that comes from that kind of sexual assault? And one of the reasons I was particularly interested in that question is because I noticed that people tended to dismiss this kind of sexual violence by saying, well, the person who has been assaulted either doesn't know that they've been assaulted, which actually happens very rarely, or is less aware of the assault while it's happening, or not aware at all, and that therefore it's somehow not existentially or ethically consequential in the same way as other kinds of sexual assault. So I wanted to argue against that position, not just by saying this is a sexual assault and it's wrong like any other, but by thinking very specifically about what we gain as human beings from being able to sleep in particular, which is of course the form of unconsciousness that we all must, as a matter of our survival as humans, enter into periodically. So it was an attempt to not just say, here's another example of a bad thing, but to think specifically about why this thing is bad in a distinctive way. And it actually ties in partly with work that I do on sexual violence, but more with work that I do on sleep. So that's actually the theme that I'm most interested in. So I was curious about the value of sleep to subjectivity, and in the article I make a complex kind of argument that draws on Frantz Fanon and various other kind of Merleau-Ponty, various existential phenomenological traditions, to suggest that the cycling through of being absent from the world and returning to it is necessary to subjectivity. And I also bring in some of the points actually that Dr. Cahill has just referred to when I talk about the necessary co-constitution of subjectivity and how we must be both be in relation as embodied subjects as well as existential subjects. And so I use that literature to try to suggest that when we're asleep, in a sense, it's up to other people to continue our existence for us, and that there is something therefore distinctively violating about that trust being exploited or violated. And it's a very ridiculously big article. It's got too many things happening in it, but another thing that happens in it is I talk about the aesthetic traditions that make particularly young white women into aesthetic objects that are actually desirable, presented as sexually desirable. And so this is called in the literature sometimes corpse chic. So the idea, or corpse porn if it's more sexually explicit, but it's actually not just pornographic, it's pervasive in fashion, for example, fashion photography. The idea that the woman who is represented as sometimes as asleep or sometimes as dead is sexually desirable. And I argue that it's very closely associated with whiteness, and that there's a particular aesthetic tradition here. And the reason that that's relevant is partly because it answers the question, why would anybody, so here's one of the sort of popular responses that I get to this work is people say, why would anybody think it's sexy to sexually assault somebody who's asleep? And I think there's a certain, sometimes false naivete to that question, because we have lots and lots of examples in our culture of the sexualization of particularly white women who are unconscious, the representation of those women, everything from Snow White and Sleeping Beauty through to Miley Cyrus music videos to exemplify how we in fact do sexualize women who are unconscious. And we do that for reasons that have to do with eroticizing passivity in white women. And this also leads to a focus on white women victims, which erases the fact that probably, we don't really know, but most likely the women who are most likely to be the victims of this form of sexual assault are Indigenous and racialized, are likely to, much more likely to be homeless or vulnerable with regard to their housing, and are much more likely to be incarcerated in various kinds of institutions, and are much more likely to have addictions. So all of those things are risk factors for this kind of sexual assault, but that's not what is shown to us. And so the article points that out. And then finally, I wanted also to talk about this tradition, drawing on the aesthetic part of it and Anne's point about the way that subjectivity works, to talk about digital communication and the way that subjectivity of the victim is erased through the ongoing digital communication of her assault. So there are a lot of cases where photos have been taken of people being assaulted or after they've been assaulted, which are then distributed through communities of people. In some drug facilitated sexual assaults, the goal of the assault is to create what's called DFSA porn, where that is, you know, overtly distributed as a profit-making activity, right, for some people who are doing it. But there's lots of venues through which these two-dimensional images of the victim of sexual violence in this context are distributed. So that's the final part of the article. So I'm just going to nip to screen share and talk very briefly about 3 ways that this work is continuing for me. So, oh, come back. So I've been thinking a lot about this work. It just won't go away. It doesn't stop. And I've got 3 projects, one of which I've done some work on, and the other 2 of which I really haven't done any work on. So I thought it might be interesting for the students, for me, just to take a couple of minutes and say how ideas sort of come, right? Like things arrive as issues for us that we feel compelled to think and write about. And the first issue that arrived for me was the issue of advance consent, which is a complicated jurisprudential question. In Canadian law, in Canadian criminal law, it's very clear that you can't give advance consent to sexual activity that will happen while you are unconscious, because consent must be contemporaneous with the activity. So if you're not actually having sex and saying yes to it, so that's a very thin understanding of consent, but let's say at the time, you can't say, you know, tonight in the middle of the night, I want you to ... right? You can't do that as a matter of law. It will be, what happens to you will be sexual assault, even if you've made that advance utterance. But that is, of course, not true in medical contexts, so a general anesthesia is involved. So I became interested in the case of pelvic exams that are performed on female people who are unconscious because of general anesthetic, where they have not given their consent to those exams, or they might have given generic consent. So if you go into hospital, you're often asked to sign a very generic consent form that says, I agree to whatever the doctors think is best for me while I am being operated upon, right? It would be better phrased than that, but that's the idea. And that had led to a very large number of pelvic exams being performed on female people without their consent. And when this became clear, various people have mobilized against it. So this is Ashley Whites, who is one of the American women who has been an activist in trying to prevent non-consensual pelvic exams being performed on unconscious women. And the tenacity of medical justifications for this procedure is surprising. So from a bioethical perspective, as a philosopher, you would think that it was quite straightforward, that this can't be justified. But the rationales that are used are in some ways resonant with the work that I've done on sexual violence, right? Where women's bodies are seen as objects, aesthetic objects, or in this case as training objects. So these are exams that are done for teaching purposes. So I've thought quite a lot about this and done quite a bit of reading about it as a question in bioethics. So that's one issue that I want to say more about that isn't yet, for me, finished.
Cressida. Sorry, Dr. Hayes, let me just interrupt you quickly. So I think we might have to unshare and reshare your screen because for us it's frozen on the first one and we want to see what you're talking about.
Okay, I will. Stop share.
Thank you for fixing it.
Yeah, no problem. Let's see if this does fix it.
Mm-hmm.
If I just keep it in preview, that's probably less likely to freeze, I suspect. Yeah. So this, you can now see, is Ashley Whites, who's an activist. So the second issue that I've done very little thinking about because the pandemic sort of got in the way is the question of how to think about the narration of sexual violence. So Dr. Cahill had referenced our colleague Susan Bryson's book Aftermath, which is a terrific attempt to speak from the subject position of somebody who's been shattered by sexual assault. Like, how do you put yourself back together and tell your story? Another book I recommend is my colleague Karen Friedman's book 1 Hour in Paris, which is quite similar to Susan Bryson's work in its attempt to tell the story of sexual assault as an exercise in reconstituting the self. But how do you tell the story of a sexual assault of which you were not aware, right? How do you do that? How do you occupy that subject position of narrator? And I wasn't really able to find compelling examples of this happening until this book. So this book was published exactly a year ago in October 2019, Know My Name, a memoir by Chanel Miller, who was formerly known as Emily Doe, the victim in the Stanford sexual assault case. So you will remember, I'm sure, this 2015 example where Brock Turner, who was the rapist, was a star athlete who sexually assaulted Miller after she had walked home from a party at which she had got very drunk, and she had passed out behind a dumpster and he had followed her and sexually assaulted her there. And she has been hugely successful at narrating her own story, even though she is one of the examples of people who cannot remember anything about the sexual assault itself. And so I'm working on a textual analysis of her memoir, which is Know My Name. But she also did, right before the pandemic, it was in December, January and February, she did a hugely successful media publicity tour, like a book tour. So she was on lots of webcasts and lots of news shows telling her story. And so what I want to do, and I haven't done it yet, is an analysis of how she was able to do that. And then the third example, and this is my last point, is when I wrote Dead to the World, one of the things I said is I'm trying to analyze particular formations of femininity. So this is a feminist analysis that talks about women victims, and overwhelmingly the victims are women and the perpetrators are men. But I'm not doing that just as a sort of let's add up all the people that this happens to and then describe them. I was doing it as a way of trying to actually work out how particular kinds of femininity work. And so my analysis was intersectional in that sense, but not complete. And so what I wanted to do was to think more about other kinds of gender formations in particular that shape the analysis that I was giving. And I couldn't say very much at the time about cases involving male victims because there weren't any in the literature. There were sort of little scraps, right? But there was no case that provided a big enough archive to be able to really draw any conclusions. And in January, the 4th trial of Reynard Sinaga concluded, and he has been described as Britain's worst rapist. So Sinaga was an international student at the University of Manchester, and he stalked young men who were attending nightclubs in central Manchester. He particularly focused on men who were very drunk, and he would accost them in the club or on the street and invite them back to his flat, where he would rape them. And most would then sort of come to later in the night or the next morning, and he was generally assumed to be what he presented himself as, which is as somebody who had helped them when they were in a bad way. And so what I want to do is an analysis of the media coverage of this case, which even in the sort of preliminary work that I've done reveals, I think, some kind of interesting differences in the way that male victims and female victims are represented and in the way that Sinaga as a perpetrator is represented. So the male victim is a very contradictory figure for the journalists who represent him. And I pulled a couple of quotes which are from the story that's referenced on the right-hand side of the screen. So the victims are represented, this is just one tiny last point example, as on the one hand kind of naive, so complacent victims. So had dozens of young women woken up in Sinaga's flat with no underwear on and no memory of the night before, would they have been more likely to suspect the worst and go to the police? Of course, there the journalists feed into a misconception that women report sexual assaults to the police, but I think the suspect the worst point is better taken. So they're represented as being kind of ignorant to the reality of sexual violence. On the other hand, they're also represented as innocent. What happened to Sinaga's victims, say Pearden Halliday, could have happened to anyone who had been out and had too much to drink, who had lost their phones and mates. So there is surprisingly little victim blaming in the coverage of these victims, even though at the same time the coverage says that the things that they did were risky. So I'm trying to explore some of these tensions in the way that male victims are represented, which I think is really different for reasons that are worth exploring. So I will just leave it there.
Okay, thank you again to everybody for this lovely event. It's really great to be back in some kind of philosophical dialogue and community. Desperately missed that during this time. I'll get right into my comments, and I have some images as well that I'll share in just a few minutes. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how some of the things I did in my book led up to the work that I'm doing now, and I'll be brief. So I had a year-long writing leave to work on my book, and my, of course, intent was to finish it, and of course I didn't. So I found myself back in the classroom in the fall of 2018, and I was still working on the introduction to the book. And for a variety of reasons, that introduction was difficult to write. I wrote several versions of that thing and was still trying to get a grip on what I wanted to do there. So what was already kind of a frantic writing process became increasingly complicated because of the events that emerged, which led up to the Brett Kavanaugh being appointed to the US Supreme Court. So these events just really unsettled me and preoccupied me. And I experienced the sort of classic car wreck scenario with them. because I was continuously trying to say, don't look at that, don't pay attention to that, you can't get caught up in that, you've got to finish this book. But my gaze kept being drawn back toward these things, right? But I could only consume print media. I could only actually read about it. It wasn't until well after the whole thing was over, well after, that I was able to read about, let alone watch, Ford's testimony. And one evening I was driving home from campus and I caught part of Kavanaugh's testimony on my car radio, and I had to pull into a parking lot and sit and wait until I could collect myself and continue on my way home. And this response that I was having made it very clear to me that I was going to have to address the situation and my own response to it if I was going to finish my book. So I did do that. I do it in the introduction and actually in chapter 5 of the book. So Foucault said that he wrote philosophy in order to change his own thinking and therefore to change himself. I wrote my book in order to make sense of and draw attention to what, in my view, was an under-theorized and very serious harm that sexual violence inflicts, right? Sexual humiliation, and to think critically and creatively about how to counter that harm. But I learned, and this speaks to something Cressida said about how ideas emerge, right? I learned that whether I intended it or not, Foucault is right. I emerged from the writing of that book changed. And my current work reflects the way in which not only my thinking, but my relationship to myself are different as a result. So in my book's introduction, I described my response to the Kavanaugh situation as a combination of rage and despair. And I didn't at the time unpack either one of those affects. But after the book was finished, in the midst of worrying that I was never going to have a new idea, never going to have a new philosophical project, I began to realize that I was still absolutely seething about the Kavanaugh situation. And I also realized that this affective experience, which I referred to at the time as anger, had been building even before Kavanaugh. And then I started to wonder why it had taken me so long to figure out that I was having an affective experience at all. And then to identify what I was experiencing and then to give it a name. And just as an aside, I distinguish in this new work between anger and rage. And I'm happy to address that in Q&A if anybody's interested. I think there can be angry and are angry expressions of rage. But I think that rage is also expressed through, for example, grief. And as I said at the outset, through despair. So these realizations and these questions opened onto the current work that I'm doing, which is new. But I'm analyzing feminist rage and affect and feminist counterviolence, a mode of action, as responses to men's gender-based sexualized violence against women. And Foucault's work informs this new project in important ways. I continue to posit the relation of self to self as the locus for both the intensification and the countering of oppressive normalizing power. But really at the heart of this new work, this analysis of feminist rage and feminist counterviolence as embodied expressions that directly counter sexual humiliation resulting from sexual violence, as well as the gendered power relations that both give rise to and are reproduced by that violence. So at the heart of this new work is the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir, and Frantz Fanon. So I'm working sort of more in an existentialist phenomenological tradition. So at this point in my work, and at this, right now I'm going to share my screen. I think. So good. At this point, I identify these characteristics of feminist rage and counterviolence. These are shared characteristics between the two. They're not the same. I'm analyzing them differently, but they do some of the same kinds of things. So they emerge in response to the contradiction between the reality that a society free from gender oppression is possible, and the denial of that reality and the subsequent blocking of social transformation. They simultaneously mark and challenge this denial and blocking as normalizing and oppressive. Feminist rage and feminist counterviolence are externalizing. That is, they are generated within, but point to a source outside the self-relation. And they are either collective in their own right, or they open on to collective modes of solidarity, feminist solidarity, as I did talk about solidarity in chapter 5 of my book. Feminist rage and counterviolence are as externalizing and collective. Feminist rage and feminist counterviolence directly and overtly counter the internalization and individuation that define sexual humiliation resulting from sexual violence. As embodied, feminist rage and feminist counterviolence oppose and undermine women's sexualized stigmatization, which I wrote about in the book as the reduction of women to a merely sexualized and merely vulnerable body. And they affirm the interconnection of the relation of self to self with relations to others and world. And finally, feminist rage and feminist counterviolence actualize freedom, construed as the capacity for self-transformation. And they do so in ways that open onto, press for, and facilitate broader social transformation. So another thing I realized when I started thinking about the subversive potential of feminist rage and feminist counterviolence was that all of the feminist anti-rape protests that I analyzed in the book, and I didn't realize this at the time, which is kind of weird to me, but there you go. They were all of the protests that I analyzed as being counter-humiliating were also expressions of rage as I was now thinking about it. And so just by way of conclusion, I wanted to have a look at one of those protests. And it's the protests that were opposing Kavanaugh's appointment and in support of Ford. So just some images here to illustrate some of these characteristics of feminist rage and feminist rage, because counterviolence is not at work here. So these protests were externalizing, right? They publicly identified sources of sexual humiliation and redirected it back against those sources, right? And this poster is one expression of that redirection, that naming and redirecting. The protests were also not only counter-individuating, but collective. They affirmed the interconnection of the relation of self to self with relations to others and world. And they also affirmed, especially in the cases of victim survivors who participated, the openness and exposure resulting from that interconnection as a basis for coming together, as a basis for feminist solidarity, right? So, in light of points number 1 and number 2, these protests were self-transformative. They reflect and promoted the exercise of critical and creative capacities in ways that undermine self-perceptions of inherent and fixed inferiority. And this activist was kissing the Statue of Justice there, right? And this, I think, is another critical and creative reflection of the kinds of themes that we're looking at here, kind of way of very embodied, right? Which is my next point, actually, that the protests were overtly and very intentionally embodied. They publicly deployed the body in ways that overtly confront, and in doing so undermine, gendered stigmatization in the form of reductive sexualization, right? This is another example of really embodied, the tape on the mouths, the writing on the hands, the dress. I wrote about this some in chapter 5 of the book. The protests were also overtly oppositional, right? Overtly and very assertively oppositional, right? Lots of raised fists in these protests. The protests also foregrounded victim survivors in their simultaneous experience of sexual humiliation and its countering, right? There wasn't a reduction of victim survivors to either one. And finally, just my last bit of conclusion here, because of the challenge that feminist rage and feminist counterviolence pose to the gendered order of things, they are suppressed in a variety of overt as well as more implicit ways. But gendered power relations are stubborn, not fixed. And so I argue that this suppression is never seamless or final. And the turning back of feminist rage and counterviolence through, for example, pathologizing expressions of rage and violence in women and encouraging women to experience them as pathological, implicitly points to an assertion of opposition and protest. For if opposition and protest were not still operative, there would be no need to try to crush them. So thank you. That's the end of my comments.
Thank you very much, all three of you. I know we all really appreciated hearing an initial orientation, hearing your work in conversation. And so I can see that there are already quite a few questions coming in the Q&A. And so Liza and Alexa and I have discerned that we have to cut down our number of roundtable questions. So we're picking our favorites. I want to let folks know with the Q&A, we want to move to the roundtable portion, and these questions that we've generated, right, we worked on together, Liza and Alexa and I. And I also want to let you know in the Q&A, so all the panelists can see the Q&A, but I want to let you know when you pose your question, feel free to let us know if you want us to say, I will assume that the questions are anonymous unless you say that, feel free to mention that I'm asking this, right? Because some of you have long relationships with the speakers, have been in conversation with them for a long time, and it might be meaningful to know who's asking, but you're not required to. So we're going to start off with the questions that we have. And I think, let's see, Liza, do you want to ask the first question?
Go for it. So Dr. Heyes draws from Dr. Cahill's earlier work on sexual violence and extends this work with attention to the limits of conscious experience and to the specific harm of sexual violence while unconscious. So to Dr. Heyes, why does Dr. Cahill's work on sexual violence provide a significant starting point for your thinking in Chapter 2 of Anesthetics of Existence? And what specific concerns arise with respect to unconscious and or intoxicated experiences of sexual violence?
Well, I think that Anne's work is begins from a premise that I share as a philosopher in general, but that one rarely sees so well articulated particularly in a lot of, I would say, ethics and political philosophy, namely that it has a very rich understanding of intersubjectivity and of the necessity of our co-constitution as subjects, and whether that is through subjectivity understood as a kind of well, it's not really in Anne's work understood cognitively. It's understood as a fully embodied kind of relation, right? So we depend on each other in a deep way to be the kind of people that we are. There's no such thing as an individual. And there is an awful lot of ethics and politics that carries on the unquestioned premise that we're all individuals, and it's that individuality that needs to be defended. And in the case of sexual violence, even, that I think is a premise that informs a great deal of certainly of the way that the criminal justice system engages with sexual violence. And I think that just doesn't get at the harms. And so Anna's, I think, done that work for us, right? But what I wanted to do was to say, well, this is an even trickier case because we're talking about how you constitute yourself as a subject in this intersubjective world where you're sometimes absent from the relation. So it's really difficult to do that. It's difficult to think that through. But if we understand sleep as a period in everyone's life when they are vulnerable and dependent, and we swap around, right? Like we were asleep at different times. There's a kind of shared humanity in that vulnerability that is, I think, important. And that's the way that I tried to make that connection.
And if I could just jump in here, I see such a clear sort of gap in my work that Cressida's work reveals, in that, you know, in my work, and this continues through a couple articles that I published in Hypatia in response to the work of Nicola Gavey, who pressed me on what she saw and I ended up agreeing with her, right? My blithe dismissal of McKinnon's assumption that female identified people can't tell the difference between sort of normative heterosex and sexual assault. And she, you know, pointed out that actually that there really is some ambiguity there. So I was working on that, and I bumped into Cressida. We were hanging out at a conference once, and I was telling her about how I'm trying to figure this out and working with Nicola's work and everything. And I said, I'm really trying, and I ended up arguing that it had to do with how agency was being deployed in unjust sex and sexual assault, and both the commonalities and the distinctions. So I'm telling Cressida about this. And in this way, those of you who know Cressida will know what I'm talking about. Cressida just looked at me and said, and why do we care about agency? You know. And I'm like, okay, good question, Cressida. I do care about agency, but I think what it reveals is that my thinking is still very much about agency, experience, you know, being out there in the world, activity. And what Cressida's brilliant new work, you know, turns to is the you know, I'm so binary about this. I don't like how binary, but the shadow side that makes the activity possible, right? The non-activity that is central to activity and that is itself generative. And so I think that's so important. And I think what Dianna's work does is takes the turn towards affect, which my work does not take, and explores affect in this embodied way. So the rage and the humiliation in Dianna's work is deeply embodied. It is visceral, right? Dianna is not talking about just having something contradicted, right? It's you know, it's like Foucault said, it's all the way down to the capillaries, right? I think it's also really interesting how we're still talking about Foucault, even though he's totally screwed it up when someone asked him about sexual assault and got it wrong. And Linda Martin Alcoff's recent book, Rape and Resistance, is another example of a feminist theorist saying, yeah, he got it wrong, but actually he still has a lot to contribute to our future understandings.
Thank you very much. Let's move to, we have some really great questions coming in from the Q&A. So we're going to skip over a couple of our own questions, but Alexa, I'd love to hear the third question that we generated on neoliberalism, which will tie into these issues or questions of agency, I think.
Yeah, so we'd like to hear more about the challenges of neoliberalism for feminism, specifically feminist efforts to counter sexual violence. Briefly, how might you define neoliberalism for the interested listener? What challenges arise with the neoliberal notion of resilience for strategies of feminist resistance? And thinking about resistance, we warmly invite any connections you might want to make to your latest thinking about rage, the anesthetic as a counter to post-disciplinary neoliberal demands, and inner vocality and vocal justice. On it first.
All right, who's going to take the neoliberalism? Oh, Cressida raised her hand.
Well, I teach in a political science department now, so I have to do this every day. Like, what is neoliberalism? And I think that the relevance of that question, there's lots of ways of defining neoliberalism, and it's a bit, you know, it's a bit of a punching bag word. But I think that what's relevant to it is the way that we're encouraged to think of ourselves as having human capital. So the way that we as individuals, very much as individuals, are compelled to kind of think of ourselves as like an object of our own investment. And you sometimes see that language in the way that that sexual violence is thought about, right? That you've damaged somebody, you've detracted from their human capital by acting violently against them. And for me, the most definitive characteristic of neoliberalism is the way that it takes economic language and encroaches it into ethics and politics. And so whenever I see economic language being used in a terrain I think of as ethical in particular, then I think, you know, we're actually just taking a language that belongs whether you agree with it or not, right, belongs in that economic sphere, and we're using it as a way of removing the possibility of a kind of richer ethical discourse about how we treat each other. So I do see some of that in the way that sexual violence gets talked about. And also in the question, interestingly, you represented the problem of resilience. And I was just doing an interview with another student about this recently, that we, you know, to the extent that we are participating in a fantasy project of infinite economic growth, we are required to be ever more productive. So I've written a lot in the context of my work on sleep about productivity and work. And one of the things that happens is that, of course, if you look at the statistics on the growth of productivity in Western economies, in the global economy, in the last sort of 30 years, it is amazing how much it's increased. And that comes at the expense of various people, right? Because inequality, wealth and income inequalities have also massively increased. So we see, to say in a sort of slightly Marxist way, the extraction of ever more surplus value from ever larger numbers of people to benefit an ever smaller number of people. And I think that the language of resilience is totally co-opted within that world, to say, if you can't survive your crappy gig economy job, then you need to be more resilient. And we even use it against students, you know, that you need to sort of work 40 hours a week and pay these increased tuition fees that we're imposing upon you, and get A's, and, you know, do all of these things that we ask of you. And if you can't, you need to work on your resilience. And so increasingly, I see a kind of very ersatz mental health language that often moves under that sign of resistance, of resilience, should be resilience being used as a kind of, I would say, neoliberal gambit to try to make people get better and work harder, instead of change the conditions that led to whatever form of injustice we're talking about. And that could include sexual violence. So there's so much terrible therapy for people who've been sexually assaulted that involves just sort of somehow trying to make you feel better about yourself, instead of articulating the contexts that make what happened possible. And that's one of the things that Chanel Miller's book is very good at.
I wanted to say along those lines that I published an article in Hypatia where I looked at you know, feminist versus neoliberal perspectives on sexual violence. And one of the things for me, given my own work on sexual humiliation, which I argue, you know, so I have this weird critique of subjectivity. I guess it's weird. Some people think it's weird. Some people think it's okay. But what I argue is that the dynamics of sexual humiliation, the dynamics of subjectivity as a mode of self-relation that presents itself as the only mode of self-relation, create the conditions for the possibility of sexual humiliation as both, it's redoubled in sexual humiliation, this internalization and individuation, right? So what I wrote about when I was problematizing neoliberalism is this very strong individuation, right? Neoliberalism, that discourse of resilience, presents itself as emancipatory, but what it's in effect saying is you have the tools to overcome this violation and they are internal to you, and all you have to do is effectively invoke them, and then you can overcome this thing. And if you don't, then it is an individual failure on your part, right? So in my view, neoliberal discourse, which presents itself as some kind of you know, a resource for victim survivors, is a condition to reproduce sexual humiliation and the conditions for its possibility. So I find neoliberal discourse deeply, deeply damaging. And I wrote that, you know, I got into that in detail in that article that I wrote.
That's really summed up in the terrible mantra, you know, no one can make you feel ashamed without your permission.
Yeah.
Which is just, you know, false. I mean, it is simply untrue. And we wouldn't want to live in a world, and a world that is populated by people who get to choose cognitively how they respond to other people's actions is not a world, I would argue, that's recognizably human. We're simply not in conscious control of that. And I mean, I think the obvious point is that we're not in conscious control. The less obvious point is that we wouldn't want to live in a world. Like, I don't think infants would survive in a world where that was the case. So a human world wouldn't exist where we were in conscious control of our reactions to other human beings' actions. Not that we're never in control, but yeah.
Okay, I'm going to pose the third question that we're going to ask of our questions, and then Alexa is excited to ask the first Q&A question. But I've gotten a number of really excellent questions from the audience, so I think all the panelists can see those questions in the Q&A and in the chat as well. So let me know if you can't access those, of course. But the last question that the three of us would like to ask is specifically to Dr. Taylor, but others are most welcome to answer. So Dr. Taylor considers what it might mean to loosen one's attachments to oneself. I've really been taken with this idea lately, and I want to think more about it. We'd love to hear more about this. We're curious how, if you could speak a bit more to this idea of loosening one's attachments to oneself as a mode of resistance, and also we're curious how this may dovetail or not with Dr. Hayes's interest in sleep as a withdrawal into anonymity, and also with Dr. Cahill's new thinking on intervocality rather than individual voice as sonorous expressions received between bodies.
Okay, so I mean that language of loosening attachments, that I take that right out of Judith Butler, right? That's Butler, and I actually adopted that language as a way to try to soften the blow of my critique of subjectivity. I was very intentional, I'll be honest with you, because I knew that a lot, for the reasons that I wrote about in the introduction, that a lot of feminist philosophers were either not going to really understand what it is that I was trying to say, or would just not really be open to hearing that argument. And as I said, I know it seems a bit of a strange argument. How can we critique the subject? Isn't that the condition for the possibility of being able to make some kind of, isn't it a condition for the possibility of intelligibility, right? I mean, that's Habermas, yeah? Habermas, like, you start critiquing this stuff, then you're going down the road of complete nonsense. And he says schizophrenia, right? And that's when Nietzsche comes to me and says, and Foucault too, if somebody's telling you that you can't critique that, then power is at work. And you ought to start taking a good, hard, critical look at whatever it is that you are told you need to be keeping your hands off of, right?
Can I interject here, just because I am probably still way too attached to subjectivity and way too attached to agency, but I want to ask you, Dianna, like, it's always seemed to me that subjectivity starts getting critiqued only at the point where members of certain social groups start claiming it who had been previously excluded from it. So part of, even though I agree with a lot of the postmodern sort of deconstruction of the subject, I'm also, thinking like, damn, just as women and people of color are starting to say we're subjects too, and your theories of subjectivity have excluded us, and we are laying claim to the full panoply of human existence, that all of a sudden, like, oh, subjectivity disappears, So, I mean, that's more of a political point, I know, than a philosophical point, but it is one of my alarm bells that goes on. Not to mention the sort of, I do have maybe just a regressive fear that, like, if we're going to have, how do we have feminist activism without, we can do it without individual subjectivity, and maybe that's where you and I would agree, right? It doesn't have to be atomistic subjectivity in a sense, but surely we need some kind of theory of action being able to act.
So, yeah, and Nancy Hartsock makes that argument against Foucault, right, in an essay from the early 90s or maybe the late 80s. That exactly what you said, and so subjectivity only becomes unpopular when oppressed folk are claiming a right to it. And what I'm arguing, so why am I critiquing it in the first place? The reason why I'm critiquing it is what I lay out in chapter 1 of the book, which is, I go to Nietzsche for this, right, and Butler, but I think that subjectivity as a mode of relating to ourselves, like how I understand and relate to myself as a subject, I think it possesses internalizing and individuating elements that provide the conditions for the possibility of sexual violence as I understand it, right? Subjectivity, I mean, sexual humiliation redoubles the individuation and the internalization. And so on my view, it actually hinders the kind of solidarity that you're wanting to talk about. And so what I tried to do in chapter 5 of the book was to say, this is a different way to think about solidarity and coming together that doesn't rely on subjectivity. So, I mean, I use the language, and it's Foucauldian language, of this relation of self to self. And what I'm arguing is that subjectivity is one mode, one possible mode of how we can understand and relate to ourselves. It presents itself as the only one. And I don't think it is. And so what I very gently tried to do, at least as gently as possible in the first chapter, was to say, feminists, can we start to loosen this up? Could we start to think about how we could understand and relate to ourselves in ways that don't reproduce the conditions for the possibility of some really damaging things that I see going on, and that I see this dependence on subjectivity. It's limiting us as to, I think, how we can think about countering sexual violence, about how we can think about solidarity, how we can think about activism, and maybe we come back to it, but let's check some other stuff out. And I was just trying to ask for that, you know, because I saw it as damaging and harmful. And I'll be very honest with that, you know, and one of the things I also said in the introduction to the book, like, why Foucault? So what I said in the book was, you know, I'm a victim survivor of rape, and existing feminist discourse on survivorship, victimology around these issues, it did not speak to my experience, right? It did not allow me to speak what had happened to me. And Foucault's work did that, right? Now, that's not going to be the case for every victim survivor, but it was for me. And so that's why I went on to write about it, because I thought maybe it is for some other folk. Maybe this speaks to the experience of some other people. So it was a way to hopefully open up and expand a dialogue.
The moments of tension and disagreement are as interesting, or perhaps more so, than the moments of agreement. If our speakers all agreed, it would be so much less captivating. So thank you so much, and thank you for your off-the-cuff thoughts, just thinking with us in the present moment. I want to shift gears to the Q&A, since there are a lot of really great questions. And so that means I'm going to stop recording, right? So this is going to be the end of recording. And I just want to say, before closing the recording, thank you so much to our 3 speakers and to Liza and Alexa for a really, really enlightening panel. Okay.